Welcome everybody to Dirshu. We are pleased to sponsor a three-part series on why study Talmud. And I wanted to acknowledge our partners in this venture, Yeshivat Chovevei Torah. Who's anybody here from Yeshivat Chovevei Torah? Yes? Okay, good. And there are others as well, but thank you. We thank them for being co-sponsors. Machon Hadar and Yeshivat Maharat as well are our three co-sponsors. And without any further introductions, I will introduce Dr. Devora Steinmetz, who will give the lecture this evening. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Welcome. I really appreciate you all coming out tonight. How many of you are teachers? Raise your hand. Great. And how many of you study Talmud? And how many of you are doing or have ever done Daf Yomi? Whether or not you completed it is a separate question. Raise your hand high. Doesn't matter this time. Come if you do it, if you raise your hand all the way. No elbow bent. Good. Okay. Excellent. Thanks. And how many people here either have or have had children who studied Talmud in school or? Sorry. Great. Why are the rest of you here? Okay. What? Okay. So, does everyone have a handout? Is it going around? Okay, well, here's one. Here's one right here. Some more. Okay. No, I'm good. Thank you. Yeah, I'm not going to start with a handout immediately, so don't worry about it. Okay, so let me first say a word about the title. I fought mightily against having the word "why" in the title. I and the other co-sponsors played with many different, much more unwieldy titles, which tried to say more of what we wanted to say. And then the last meal of Rosh Hashanah, it actually wasn't Rosh Hashanah, it was the last meal of that 3-day thing, Shabbat lunch. There were 12 people around our table, and I said, oh, it's great, we're going to have this amazing series, and I rolled out the title, and there was dead silence. And you were there, and somebody, I don't know if it was you, said, why don't you just call it Why Study Talmud? And everybody said, yeah! So anyway, so that's what we're calling it. But let me say a word about why I didn't want to use the word why, and why the word why doesn't really say what we all want to say, or at least not what I want to say. First of all, the word why, it means so many different things. We think it's a really clear question, but actually it can be asking all sorts of different things, as anybody who's ever been in the presence of a 2-year-old knows. I want to answer to you. But very often, I think, when we think of kind of the primary meaning of why, in a phrase like why study Talmud or why learn Talmud, we think of it in terms of what is the purpose, which is not necessarily a bad question. On the other hand, at least in my view, asking why in the sense of what is the purpose can make it sound like the activity of learning Talmud is kind of instrumental, right? We do it because for such and such ends. And whenever we think of doing something for such and such ends, it can be seen as reducing the activity to those ends, and its value being limited to the ends that it serves. That's what I mean by it being instrumental. And I guess I don't see Talmud study that way. We could ask, why Talmud study over the course of time has taken the centrality of place that it has in our Talmud Torah. We could ask why it takes the centrality that it has in our rabbinic training, in our schools. All of those are good questions, and we could ask whether that should even be so. But is this giving feedback, or is that my imagination? So why didn't you tell me? Is that better?
Yeah.
Okay. If anything sounds horrible or you don't like me, just let me know. Don't be shy. anything that asks about it in a way that sort of reduces it to an instrumental sense or something I wasn't so comfortable with. And I think, the kind of the purpose of the Dirshu series in general, and I don't know how many of you have been at any of the other ones, but we started out last spring with one on prayer, called Prayer, What Are We Doing? Then we had one on mental illness, and now we're doing this one, and we hope to have a couple of others this year. They're in the works right now. And really the purpose of them is to take something that we do, or something that does exist in our lives, that presents challenges to us, and take that as a given, right? This is something in our lives that presents a challenge to us. And not ask whether it should be in our lives as much as say, okay, well, let's think about that. Let's think about what that means. Let's think about how we understand that. Let's think how we can deal with it in a way that brings meaning and wealth to our lives. So it's not so much about why, in the sense that if we can't give a good answer, we shouldn't be doing it, right? It's more that, well, we do this, and what's it really about, right? What is its meaning in our lives as Jews? And that's really the kind of longer description of what the title was supposed to have been, had you and your family not been so devastatingly silent when we rolled out the real title. So what I'm going to talk about tonight, I call this talk Talmud Study as a Religious Practice. And what I'm going to be talking about is how I think Talmud study can, which doesn't necessarily mean it does, but how I think Talmud study can cultivate habits of heart and mind that are important for the religious formation of a person and of a Jewish person. What I'll be doing is highlighting several aspects of Talmud study. Some of them will kind of overlap and intersect with each other, so there'll be a little looping back and overlapping and things like that. And I'm going to introduce each one with a brief passage from either the Talmud or one of the Talmud's commentators. So the handout you have in front of you, there's a lot of blank space in the thought that people might want to jot down notes or questions or doodles or whatever you want to do with that space that keeps you engaged in the talk. Yes. Oh, great. So raise your hand high if you don't have a hand up. Okay. So the first text is actually from the Ramban. This is the Ramban in Milchemet Hashem on Masechet Sanhedrin. This is actually a very famous sugya that if you do teach Talmud in high schools, you're likely to teach the sugya. It's the sugya of Rodef, actually of Bava Machteret. And very long, difficult milchamos there. And at a certain point, he says the following thing. Let me just acknowledge straight out that all the little passages that I have are taken completely out of context. but hopefully I'm still being true to what they mean. Okay, he says, Ve'en zo derech ha-Talmud, right? He's arguing against a certain interpretation. He says, Ein zo derech ha-Talmud, dehar gor'inu mosifim b'memrei, u'mechasvi nami ma'niyata, u'meshabshi loho, u'mimash chani nafshai hutfei, v'tiwutze memra d'Rabaiho. So he says this, the thing he's arguing against, this is not the way of the Talmud. What's the this that he's talking about? He says it's, and I sort of added some things in brackets here, it's not the way of the Talmud to construe the statement of an Amora in a way that leads to the rejection of a statement. In other words, he's talking about a particular interpretation of the sugya that sees, that imagines that the position of a certain Amora, a Talmudic sage, is simply rejected out of hand. And he says that can't be right because that's not how the Talmud works. Right? It's not the way of the Talmud to simply reject the statement of an Amora out of hand. We rather, what do? He says what they do, meaning what the Talmud does, is they subtract from and add to Amoraic statements in order to make them plausible. They declare Talmudic sources to be missing material that renders the meaning of the statement different, or to be faulty, so that it no longer serves as a refutation of the Amoraic sage's position, and they put themselves in pledge to resolve the statements of their teachers. And this is a kind of a complicated text. What Ramban is talking about is something that I think for those of us who learn Talmud, and certainly for those of us, I think, who teach Talmud, to relative beginners who are first kind of learning the ways of the Talmud, And one thing that people, especially early on in the process, can find puzzling and maybe even sometimes disturbing, is that the Talmud, among many other principles, has a principle that that in theory, an Amora, right, a later sage, a Talmudic sage, is never supposed to disagree with a Tana, right, with the words of an earlier sage, a sage of the Mishnaic period. But when it actually happens that an Amora makes a statement that seems to be contradicted by a Tanaitic ruling, that statement, the statement of the later sage, is rarely refuted. Rather, the Talmud goes into one of a number of different possible ploys, strategies that the Talmud employs in order to seek to defend the Amora's ruling. And the Ramban mentions some of them. For example, they might declare the Tanaitic source, which seems to contradict the Amora, to be missing material. They might actually change the wording, right, of the Tanaitic source in order to make it not contradict the Amora. Or they might say we have to understand the source in a totally different way. Right? There's all sorts of different strategies that the Talmud does. And again, I think very often students of the Talmud, and especially beginning students of the Talmud, find this a bit disturbing because we wonder, is that what the Tanaitic source really meant? Right? Did it really mean this new thing, right? This ukimta, right? This new understanding that the Gemara suggests? Was it really missing words? And if you just add these words in, it's all right, right? It seems there's something that sometimes seems a little disingenuous even about that kind of strategy. The Ramban, on the other hand, sees these kinds of strategies as embodying a core ethic of the Talmud. And that core ethic, for the Ramban, I think it's a core ethic that, in a certain sense, shapes the Ramban's in most of his life's work as well. If you think of many of the core things that he wrote, actually their project is to defend the traditions of those who came before. So, for example, his commentary on the Rambam's Sefer HaMitzvot. And what he's really saying is the Rambam was constantly saying the Gaonim made mistakes in enumerating the mitzvot, and the Ramban comes along and says, now wait a second, right? Let's not just dismiss what the Gaonim said out of hand so easily. Let's look back at them and see, right, is there a way that might make sense? It's very similar, by the way, to the Ramban al-HaTorah. The Ramban al-HaTorah is going to look at what Rashi says, which of course is often citing earlier Midrashim or Talmudic texts, and he'll mention that, and then he'll perhaps offer his own interpretation, and then very, very often he'll go back and he'll say, but let's see if we can understand this ancient tradition, this midrashic interpretation, in a way that makes sense with the plain understanding of the biblical text. So that really, the Ramban himself, the way of the Talmud that he describes here is really something I think is very important to him in terms of how he sees his own life's work. And what that is about is something that I'll do a fancy quote. Gadamer, who's a writer on hermeneutics, talks about the obligation to try to understand how what the author is saying could be right? A kind of reading that tries to understand how what the author said could be right. And that's what the Ramban, I think, is talking about here. That it's our obligation when we read, and the way the Talmud reads, for example, an Amoraic statement, is to try to read it in a way that it could be right. Which doesn't mean that it is right. It means that it could be right. Okay? What the Ramban is suggesting here, I think, is a kind of a larger idea that that our encounter with any text, certainly with a statement of the greats that came before us, but also perhaps with the words of anybody who sits around us, anybody we're speaking to, that our encounter with somebody else's words demands that we try to make sense of it, that we experiment with ways of seeing whether it might be plausible, and whether it might have something to say, despite the fact that at first glance it seems wrong, or it seems irrelevant, or it seems to be out of sync with the way we see the world. So I think what the Ramban is suggesting is that Talmudic reasoning, and particularly, as I said, perhaps the part of Talmudic reasoning that makes us most uneasy at times, gives us practice in a practice. Right? It gives us practice in the practice, not in parking our good judgment to say that all positions are equally plausible because everything can make sense, and I don't think that's what we're supposed to be doing. But the practice of seeing whether there's a way in which we can understand the words of the other in the best possible way of understanding the words of the other on the way to developing our own best understanding. Right? There's kind of two moves here. Right? One is seeing the best way to understand the other, but not necessarily accepting it, but just trying our hardest to see whether there's a way to make it plausible. And I wanted to kind of characterize the qualities that I think are required here by naming a few specific qualities. Because I think that this is, it's not just a kind of intellectual activity, but it's also a kind of moral activity. Right? What we're talking about here is a kind of a generosity. Right? It's a practice that develops generosity because it refuses to dismiss too easily something that we encounter that at first appears to be wrong or in conflict with our beliefs. Right? The Ramban uses very strong language. He says we put ourselves in pledge. Right? The Talmud puts itself in pledge in order to defend the words of those who came before. So it can take a lot of effort to do that. That's where the generosity comes in. Right? You have to really actually make an effort to try to understand what is being put before you. And at the same time, it takes humility, right? Because, the impulse often is to assume that I immediately understand what somebody else is saying, or what I'm reading, or what somebody said ages ago. I immediately understand that person's intent, and I can immediately judge it at face value, rather than the humility to think that maybe that other thing has an insight that's not immediately apparent to me. So what I'm suggesting is that what the Ramban is talking about is not just something limited to how we can help an Amora not be contradicted by a Tana, but something that if you practice it, and the Talmud in a sense is helping us practice this, develops or can develop the both intellectual and moral virtues of generosity and humility. And at the same time, as I said before, that doesn't mean that we simply accept everything that somebody says, right? But attempting to read something or to hear something most generously simply means, right, that I'm engaging that other point of view and trying to understand it in its best light on the way to ultimately coming to what seems to me to be most reasonable, which is very important as well. And I would label that as employing courage and integrity, right? So along with the generosity and humility, I also have to have the courage and integrity to say, I've tried my best, I've made my best effort, I've wrapped my head around this, and at the same time, it seems to me that that's maybe not the right understanding. And that takes courage, and it also takes integrity, right? The truth to what you believe. The Muhammad actually has a very nice description at the very beginning of his commentary, of his Talmudic commentary, where he says he actually differentiates between Talmudic study and geometry. And remember geometry, it has proofs. And he says that unlike geometry, in Talmudic study, there's generally no solid proof of what is right? There are good arguments. And at the same time, ultimately, we have to use our best judgment to determine what is most plausible, what we should believe in, and what we should act upon. And the Ramban says that is the goal of every wise and God-fearing person in the study of Talmud. And when you think about it, those who study Talmud with Rishonim, that is really what many of the Rishonim are doing. Right? On the one hand, they are trying to make the best sense of what the Talmud has to say, and at the same time, and maybe of multiple different opinions, at the same time, coming down on a particular interpretation that seems to them to be most plausible. So I'm suggesting that the practice of Talmud study is not only in a sense about how we do that when we study Talmud, but that at its best, it can inspire us to try to infuse these same commitments into the way we lead our lives, into how we encounter other people with whom we disagree, other people who make us uncomfortable, into how we decide what to believe and to what path we ought to commit ourselves. And I was thinking about this a couple of weeks ago, and it struck me that in a certain sense, I live a good part of my life right now in a completely in a completely non-Jewish environment, which isn't to say that there aren't a lot of Jews, half-Jews, and quasi-Jews. There are, but a very non-Jewish environment in the sense that nobody there really knows very much about Judaism, and everybody knows that I teach Talmud, and they're always asking me what the Talmud is about, right? Which is really hard to explain. But I was thinking a couple of weeks ago, as I was beginning to think about this talk, that in a certain sense, and this is not what I answer when they ask me, but then in a certain sense, if you wanted to think about what Talmud is about, in a way, Talmud is a book which is, at its heart, a book of trying to understand. That's actually, when you think of it, what Talmud is about. Right? It's not just that we're trying to understand Talmud, but all of Talmud, or much of Talmud in a way, is a book that what it's doing is trying to understand. Right? First, of course, it's a book that in one way or another, in multiple different ways, stands in relation to the Tanakh. And much of it, not all of it, is trying to understand what the Torah actually means. In fact, anybody here work with, what's it called? The new web-based platform? Yes, anybody here work with Sefaria? So I almost brought in, there's an amazing, yes, okay, there's an amazing thing on Sefaria which somebody sent out where you can click on any book of Tanakh. In fact, you can even go small, any chapter or whatever, but let's say any book of Tanakh and any Masechet of the Talmud, and it has these kind of really cool computer-generated diagrams of the intersections of those things. Anybody see this? It's very cool. But anyway, in some sense, a lot of the Talmud, not all of it for sure, but a lot of the Talmud is trying to understand what the Chumash actually means. And of course, a lot of the Talmud is later sages trying to find out what the earlier sages mean, or the Gemara trying to understand what the other sages meant. And then, of course, when you come to the commentaries, right, the commentaries trying to understand what the Gemara meant. So it means, so in a certain sense, that is what the activity of Talmud is about. It's not just this topic or another topic. And I tell a little anecdote. A bunch of years ago, I was in Boulder. Before your son was the rabbi, there was a different rabbi, and I was sitting in on the rabbi's Talmud class just to sort of get to know him and get to know the community. And I don't remember what text he was teaching, but it was one of these texts which I'd say was not on the surface incredibly meaningful. Okay? And at the same time, he's teaching this in a community Talmud class, small group of people who don't know very much about Talmud, and he's trying very hard to make it meaningful. And so he developed some kind of very meaningful spiritual insight. And then he turned to me afterwards and he said, "Is there any other way to teach it?" And so that kind of got me thinking. And on the one hand, I thought, well, that's really nice, right? To try, imrei kum mikem, right? If the Torah seems empty, it's because you failed to find the spiritual significance. So that's very nice that he found the spiritual significance. And I thought to myself, maybe actually the significance of this text, right, is that the text is trying to figure something out. It was a text. It was a text where the Talmud was trying to offer an interpretation of a very difficult biblical passage, right? And it offered two different interpretations. And he was trying to find significance in spiritual significance in the two different opinions about the biblical text that the Talmud was explicating. And I sort of said, I don't know if I said to myself or to him, I don't remember, that maybe actually that is the meaning of it, right? Maybe the meaningfulness of this text is not, the spiritual insight that this interpretation gives versus this interpretation, but the very fact that the Talmud positions itself as trying to really figure out what the Torah is telling us. That's actually pretty meaningful when you think about it, right? And so the fact that it's the Talmud's job to understand what the Torah means, and it's the Amoraim's job to understand what the Tanaim mean, and it's the Gemara's job to figure out what the Torah and the Tanaim and the Amoraim mean, and we could go on recursively like that. There's something about that which I think is itself very important, and that in a certain sense, that the purpose of trying to understand is not just the meaning you get out of it, but that the purpose of trying to understand is the effort to understand. That there's something very powerful about that, and something that we kind of can learn to do through studying Talmud. So that was the first thing that I wanted to suggest. The next source, first flip the page, I think, page 2, is a very, very famous brief source. It comes from Masechet Kiddushin, And it talks about a machloket between Rabbi Tarfon and Rabbi Akiva as to which is greater, Talmud or Maaseh, which I'll translate here. I'm sorry? Is it in the wrong order? Oh, shoot, I'm sorry. Ariella, I gave you, when I fixed the handout, I forgot to reorder the pages. Sorry, page 4. Okay. Okay, so I'll translate it as study and action, and maybe slightly different, but for our purposes, that's good enough. So is study greater or is action greater? They disagree about that, and then everybody else in the room sort of speaks up and decides all together. They all come to agreement that study is greater. Talmud gadol sha Talmud mevi lidei maaseh, because study leads to action. So, one of the things that also I think when you're talking to people who have no clue what the Talmud is, and as I said, I get asked this all the time, is what's very hard to explain. I mean, it's hard to explain because it's so many different things, right? It's a very complicated text, but it's also hard to explain, I think, that the sacred text with which we spend so much time is a text that, for the most part, not totally, but for the most part, is talking about what we do, which is not to say, I know how many people hear what Rabbi Katz is talking. I'm not saying that it's a book of halacha. That's a separate point, so we'll talk about that in a second. But it is talking about what we do, not all of it, but a lot of it, which is very interesting when you think about it, right? If you were a Buddhist, not the kind of Buddhist who meditates all day, but the kind of Buddhist who's within the scholastic tradition, the text that you would be talking about and arguing about and memorizing would be texts about philosophy and theology. We could imagine other texts, like the Gospels, that are mostly a story, with ethical teachings and all sorts of other things, but really take the form of a story, right? There's many different kinds of foci that one could imagine of a text that people spend a lot of time on. And our core text, in the sense of what we spend a lot of time on, our talmudic text, is a text which is, for the most part, again, not exclusively, but for the most part, talking about action. And what I want to suggest about that is that what that does is make deliberation on action a religious act. Right? It's a religious act to deliberate on action. It's a religious practice to think about, deliberate on, and argue about how one should act in a variety of complex circumstances. Now, I like to think, it may not be true, but I like to think also that spending as much time as those of us who study Talmud do in this process of deliberating on action and in seeing different sides of an issue, which the Talmud is, of course, notoriously great at doing, and in getting into the complexity of it and in being able to argue all the different sides of it, I like to think that whereas for the most part, the Talmud is not a halachic text in the sense that it easily, or for the most part explicitly, comes to specific conclusions, and it's not a book of psak, right, of decisions, halachic decisions. I like to think that having that practice helps create individuals who have perhaps, and this may not be true at all, a better time at coming to decisions in hard situations. Right? You're used to thinking about complex decisions. Now, that's not necessarily true, of course, because there's a very big difference between thinking about things in the abstract and thinking about things and applying them in the real world. But I like to think that there is something helpful about learning how to see the complexity of a situation. And minimally, even if it doesn't help us be better at coming to good decisions in hard situations, minimally, I think that it should help us understand that these decisions are complex, right? Not something to rush in and assume that there's an easy answer, but to understand the complexity that comes into decision making. But separate from decision making, I think that one can imagine the fact that Talmud study is so much about asking us to think how to act, that it gets us in the habit of focusing on the choice, reflecting on the choices that we make, and taking note of the consequences of the things that we do. And also, what I hope, and again, it can not work this way as well, but I like to think, and so many of these things have to do with the choices that we make when we teach and study Talmud, but I also like to think that the fact that it focuses so much on action and on deliberation on action, that it orients us a certain way, that it orients us toward thinking about how we ought to act in the world in big and small ways, not only in the huge decisions, but thinking really all the time how it is that we should position ourselves in the world with an orientation toward action. So that's a second thought. Now my pages are all mixed up, so I'll just say a source and somebody yell out what page we're on. I apologize that I did this wrong. So the next source, it's probably page 2 now, and then it'll probably go in order after that. But this is the one from Ta'anit. Yeah, okay. So this is a really fun source. It's actually a pretty funny source, I think. It comes from a Masechet Ta'anit, and Rabbi Yitzchak says to Rabbi Yochanan had asked Rabbi Yitzchak to, Rav Nachman had asked Rabbi Yitzchak to give over a teaching from Rabbi Yochanan. That's what's going on here. So Rabbi Yitzchak says to Rav Nachman, Hachi amar Rabbi Yochanan, Yaakov Avinu lo met. Right? Thus said Rabbi Yochanan, Jacob our father did not die. To which Rav Nachman says to him, was it for naught that the eulogizers eulogized him and the embalmers embalmed him and the buriers buried him? Which is pretty funny. Right? In other words, it says explicitly, right, that they wept for him and they embalmed him and they buried him, right? So what do you mean he didn't die? Right? Did they do that for naught? So Rabbi Yitzchak says to him, you don't understand. Amar le mikra ani doresh, ne'emar v'ata al tira avdi Yaakov mi'um Hashem v'al tichat Yisrael ki hinini moshiacha merachok ve'et zaracha me'eretz shivya makishu l'zaro ma'zaro b'chayim afhu b'chayim. So he says to him, he quotes a verse in Jeremiah. He says, I'm expounding scripture, I'm being doresh scripture, as it says, but you do not fear my servant Jacob, says the Lord, and do not dread Israel, for I will deliver you from afar, and your descendants from the land of captivity, of their captivity. He's focusing on that last set of phrases. I will deliver you from afar, and your descendants from the land of their captivity. The verse juxtaposes him, Jacob, and his descendants. Right? I will deliver you and your descendants. Okay? The verse compares or juxtaposes Jacob and his descendants. Just as his descendants live, so he lives. So I'm going to move now to a kind of very different aspect of Talmud study, which to me is quite important. And that is the fact that the Talmud, for those of us who spend a lot of time with it, the Talmud is kind of a universe that you walk into. It's a universe inhabited by people and practices, beliefs, events, ways of life, stories. It's a rich, thick cultural universe, which is both ours, because we're so familiar with it, and it's also very different from the universe in which we live. For Rabbi Yitzchak, our ancestor Jacob is not a person who lived in the past. He's not a character in an ancient story. For him, Jacob is alive. And why is he alive? He's alive because we're alive. Right? If we're alive, he's alive. Right? Jacob lives in our experience of Jacob as our father. Right? He, for us, is a real person. Right? We are implicated in his life, and actually he is implicated in our life. Right? I will deliver you and your descendants. Right? We live in the same life. So I think what Rabbi Yitzchak is saying here, right, Yaakov Avinu lo met, Jacob our father did not die, is offering a challenge to a modern learner of traditional texts, and not only Talmudic texts, but traditional texts in general, but focusing here on the Talmud. we have kind of two choices, right? Do we approach these texts as artifacts of an ancient culture, kind of archaeology, not in the sense that Rabbi Katz is using it, but in the sense of digging up something that was dead and buried, digging up something from the past, right? A culture that lived in the past but is now dead to us. Or on the other hand, do we experience these texts as living worlds, as embodying a universe that is alive for us and in which we live, right? In which the figures of the past and we ourselves live together, right? Just as we live, so they live. Right? And those are two very, very different ways of approaching an ancient text like the Talmud. And in fact, there's many different methods, of course, as we all know, of studying Talmud. Different methods ask different questions, different methods ask different tools. But at the same time, very importantly, I think different methods of studying Talmud construct and are constructed by different relationships between the learner and the text. So while any kind of modern learner of a traditional text recognizes the tremendous cultural differences between yourself and the text, that recognition doesn't necessarily mean that you approach the text as an artifact of a world that's dead and embalmed and buried. What engaging in Talmud study does is offer the possibility of an alternative experience. It offers an invitation to participate in a world in which we know these people, right? We not only know our forefather Yaakov, but we know the rabbinic heroes and the rabbinic anti-heroes of our past. We know Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Yeshua, and those who learn Talmud and know the stories and know the Shakavatariya and enter into it, I think know what I mean, right? You know these people. If you met them, you would recognize them almost, right? Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Yeshua, Rabbi Gamla, Rabbi Eliezer, Bruria, Ima Shalom, right? Abaye and Rava, Rav and Rav Yosef. We know these people. The stories and figures of rabbinic tradition construct a universe of shared memory and meaning that we participate in, is a kind of a shared frame of reference that I have with the text and that we all have with each other with the text that gives thickness to our identity as Jews. And in a way, when I think of the Zohar, which is not a book I know a whole lot about, but in a way that's really what the Zohar does. Right? What the Zohar does is choose to imagine its own spiritual quest as the quest of Shimon Bar Yochai and his troop of disciples wandering the hills of the Galilee. Right? We are not just walking in their footsteps, we are them. Right? They are us. Right? Dor v'darshel, that each generation, right, is doresh. Just like here, right? The way you bring something to life is mikra'ani doresh, Rabbi Yitzchak says. And in fact, each generation has been doresh, and we join our quest, our drisha, to those who came before us. So, and that's true, of course, not only, it's true also in the difficult times of our lives. And I'm reminded a few years ago, I was actually teaching Masechet Ta'anit, from which this text comes. I was teaching it at Hebrew University in the Chavruta program. And we were finishing the Masechet. We did the whole Masechet over the course of the year. We were finishing the Masechet at the very end of the year, and I was teaching the section about what happens on Tu B'Av. Right? We have Tu B'Av. What is Tu B'Av? What events does Tu B'Av commemorate? And the Gemara mentions several possibilities, and one of the possibilities that it mentions is that was the day on which the people killed at Beitar were allowed to be buried. Right? Beitar was had to do with the second rebellion against the Romans. It was a terrible massacre, and people were killed, and they weren't allowed to be buried. At a certain point, they were allowed to be buried. And the Gemara says that happened on Tu B'Av. And the Gemara in Brachot says actually the fourth blessing of Birkat Hamazon, Hatov V'Amitiv, was instituted in gratitude, right, for the fact that Haggai Beitar, that the people killed at Beitar were given to be buried. So I was teaching this text, the text from the end of Tanit, but Tu B'Av, actually at the time that we remember a few years ago, so many things have happened since, it's almost hard to remember this now, but at the time, what was riveting the Jewish people, and especially those of us who were in Israel at the time, was the kidnapping of Goldwasser and Regev. and not knowing if they were alive or not alive, and the negotiations and the trade and all those kinds of things. And I was teaching this text actually on the day before the deal had been struck, and on the day before they were going to be returned. And most people kind of thought they weren't alive, but we didn't really know for sure. And I was teaching this text, and of course everybody's thinking of exactly that. Well, the next day, right after the day I taught this text, I happened to be in the cafeteria getting a cup of coffee, and the TV was playing. And this was actually the moment at which something was going to be coming over the border. Okay? You know, of course, everybody's riveted to the TV set, and of course, 2 coffins were handed over. And after a few minutes, the TV camera, went to the house of one of the families who had lost either Goldwasser or Regeb, I don't remember which one. A rabbi was walking in the house, and of course, the reporter asked the rabbi to say something that kind of encapsulated the experience of. It's a typical reporter thing, right? The rabbi actually quoted the Gemara from Masechet Brachot, right? That on the day that Harogei Beitar were given over to burial, the Jewish people instituted the blessing HaTov HaMeitim, and so that's a kind of a horrific example of this. But there's something about this notion that the experience that we have, the very particular experience that we have right now, either individually or as a people, resonates so deeply with an experience that we know, from living in both of these worlds at the same time. That's kind of an example of that. Okay, next text. Sorry, I didn't mean to bring things down so serious. Okay. Okay, so the next text is focusing on something quite different. And actually, I don't know if any of you were here, actually just about a year ago in October, we had a Yom Yun here on the study of Mishnah in memory of Rivka Rosenwein. And I spoke about the idea of Torah Sheba'al Peh as oral Torah. What does it mean to have oral Torah? And I spoke about this text then. So this is a very famous text from Masechet Kitin. Actually, they're both very famous texts. The first one, Dvarim shebechtav iya Torah shelo omran al peh, Dvarim sheba'al peh iya Torah shelo omran bechtav. Right, things that are written, right, written Torah, you're not permitted to say orally, and oral Torah. Sorry, the English quotation doesn't quote the whole thing. So I'll just listen to what I'm saying. Instead, things that are written, you're not allowed to say orally. Things that are oral, you're not allowed to put in writing. And focusing on that second part, things that are oral, you're not allowed to put in writing. And the second text, which is not immediately related to that, but I will try to relate them. Yeshua ben Prachi Omer, this is a question from Masechet Avot. Aseh lecha rav uknei lecha chaver. Make for yourself a teacher and acquire for yourself a companion. Excuse me. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the notion, and this is just a very, very brief piece of something that I talked a lot more about a year ago, but just a little bit about the notion of Torah Sheba'al Peh as something that is actually a spoken medium. And I wanted to start out by making reference to a point made by there's a fellow named Walter Ong, who wrote a book, Orality and Literacy. Anybody familiar with that book? It's a very cool book. I mean, it might be that 99% of what he says is wrong, or not. I don't know, but it gets you thinking. So it's a great book in that way. But one of the things he points out is that he talks about the difference between a culture where the primary way of accessing text is oral and a culture where the primary way of accessing text is in writing. And he makes the point, which is so obvious once you think about it, that the act of reading a book is essentially a private act. Right? When you open a book, right, some author someplace has put things down in print. That author is now completely separated from the text. You open that text and you can open it, you could have it covered in a brown paper bag so nobody even sees what you're reading, or you could be reading it in the privacy of your room, and it's just you and that text. The author's not in the room, there's nobody else in the room, but you access the meaning completely privately. And that is kind of the antithesis of how you encounter an oral text. Because an oral text, which is actually an oral text, right, that's no longer necessarily the way we encounter what we call Torah Sheba'al Peh, because now we encounter it in writing. But thinking of it as fundamentally an oral text, right, but by design, an oral text means, among many other things, that you can never access it privately. Right? You can only ever access an oral text through the medium of somebody else being present, right? Somebody has to speak it to you, at least the first time you encounter it. Eventually you can memorize it, and then you can go over it yourself. But minimally, the very first time that you encounter an oral text, you are encountering it through the mediating presence of another person. Likely, there might be other people around as well. Right? Maybe that person is reciting it to you with other people around as well. But minimally, there's at least one other person there. Right? It shatters the whole possibility of an initial private encounter between a person and a text. Right? A text is always encountered in the context of a relationship. So an encounter with a text is also always an encounter with another person. So I just wanted to talk for a couple of minutes about the idea of encountering a text at the same time that you encounter another person. And I want to suggest that in a culture in which you actually encounter a text orally, the encounter with the other person becomes an inseparable part of the experience of the text. We can all actually think about this if you can come back to childhood, or this can also happen in adulthood, of course, but if you think to childhood, perhaps of a time that you heard a story for the first time, right? You probably can, when you think about the story, right, actually think about the person who told you the story, the other people who were in the room, some of the things the person said about the story, the mood that they brought to the story, and maybe something about the occasion. Right? That actually becomes part of that text. You can't even think about that story separate from, right, the encounter with that person. I had that, for example, with the story of Tanur Shalachnai. I first encountered it in a kind of very unusual setting of an optional Gemara class that my fifth grade teacher taught on a Sunday morning to little kids in the school who wanted to come. And it was just a lovely setting. Everybody wanted to be there. There was a great love of Talmud Torah in the room, and he told the story. And his, his face and the way he thought about Torah and the way we experience Torah is an inseparable part of the story for him. And the text does not live by itself. So that's why I juxtapose these two texts here, the text about Dvarim Sheba'al Peh, right, things which are oral, and the idea of a teacher and a chaver, right, a teacher and a learning companion. Right? The notion that learning, right, the emphasis here on learning as being an interpersonal experience between you and a teacher or companions who together try to assimilate and understand what's being learned. Now, of course, nowadays, we all encounter the Talmud as a written text. Although I think for many of us, because the Talmud is so opaque a text, we still, at least early on, often need a teacher to help us learn how to learn it. And in fact, I want to mention here, I don't know if anybody ever heard of, remember Judith Abrams? Judith Abrams, is that her name? So she actually passed away earlier this week. She was an amazing woman who actually started studying as an adult and made it her life's work to write books and probably later on also use web media, I would imagine, to make Talmud study accessible to a layperson who is not necessarily sitting there with a teacher. So nowadays we have all sorts of ways to do that. And so I want to acknowledge her work in her life. But what's interesting is that even those who encounter a text in a written way, there's something about studying Talmud which tends to bring with it the notion of encounter nonetheless. For example, the fact that we tend to study Talmud with a chavruta, I think, is not an accident. Right? There's something about Talmudic study which almost demands that we learn it from another and with another. And in a certain sense, that's almost an extension of the nature of the Talmudic text itself, which is itself kind of a conversation, right? It's a dialogical text, and we study it, dialogically. And of course, as many people point out, the very printed page of the Talmudic text kind of extends that dialogical nature as other commentaries from other times talk back to the text. And as we cross-reference later commentaries and later codes, and there's this kind of dialogue that happens on the page. So even if you're studying totally by yourself, even when there's nobody else around, there's still a sense in which I think many of us experience Talmud study as participation in a conversation that takes place over huge spans of time of time and space. And I want to suggest a couple of implications of experiencing Torah Sheba'al Peh in this way, experiencing Torah Sheba'al Peh as a kind of a mediated Torah that lives in conversation with others and then invites us to join that conversation. So first of all, I think that reminds us that Torah is not a disembodied thing. Right? Just as I mentioned before, when I think of a particular story, I see the face of the person who taught it to me. I feel the presence of the people who learned it with me. It reminds us that Torah is not just a disembodied thing happening in our own minds, that it has to do with an encounter, and that as I encounter a text, I'm also encountering others, and as I encounter others, I'm also encountering a text. And at the same time, the notion that Torah Sheba'al Peh, or the Talmud in particular, is essentially an unbounded text, right? We see it now on pages, but essentially it's unbounded, right? It goes beyond the boundaries of the page. It's bigger than any one person's understanding, at the same time that it's comprised of every person's understanding. It reminds us that studying Talmud or studying Torah can never be the same two different times that we do it. I'm reminded of I think it's the Ramban who says, why did Moshe need to be on the mountain for 40 days and 40 nights when he was getting the second luchot? Right? He already learned the Torah the first time he was up there for 40 days and 40 nights. So what's the last 40 days and 40? Right? The first time he's learning Torah, the second time he's praying. What's the third time for? Right? And the Ramban says, because the Torah that you learn, I may not be saying this exactly the way he says it, but fundamentally the Torah that you learn after you break the luchot is not the Torah that you learned before you broke the luchot. Right? He's a different person at a different time, and it's a different Torah. And I think that Torah Sheba'al Peh, as Torah that is always mediated in encounter, reminds us that we cannot learn Torah disembodied from our experience and from the experience of the others around us and the reality of those around us. Now another somewhat humorous text, although this text feels a little less humorous this week than it might have felt a couple weeks ago, but I'm going to leave that aside. A lot of you probably know this text. Okay, so Tanya, this is from Masechet Brachot. Amar Rabbi Akiva, Pam achat nechnasti achar Rabbi Yeshua lebeit hakisei v'lemadati mimenu shlosha dvarim. Amar le ben Asai, ad kan he'azta v'necha rabcha. Amar le Torahi v'lelmod ani tzarich. Tanya ben Asai omer, Pam achat nechnasti achar Rabbi Akiva lebeit hakisei v'lemadati mimenu shlosha dvarim. Amar lo Rabbi Yehuda, ad kan he'azta v'necha rabcha. Amar lo Torahi v'lelmod ani tzarich. Rav Kahana al, I just want to let you know that I'm leaving out all the juicy parts. So if you want to know what actually happens, you have to go back to the text. Rav Kahana al, gana tukute purye durav. Amar lo Kahana, ha puk, lav arach. Amar lo Torahi v'lelmod ani tzarich. So the Gemara tells a story. Rabbi Akiva says that one time I entered behind Rabbi Yeshua to the bathroom and I learned 3 things from him. And Ben Asai said to him, wow, you were this brazen with your master? And he said, it's Torah, and I needed to learn it. And then Ben Asai, right, the interlocutor of Rabbi Akiva in the first story, says, well, one time I went after Rabbi Akiva to the bathroom, and I learned from him 3 things. And Rabbi Yehuda says to him, you were that brazen with your master? And he said, it's Torah, and I need to learn. And then it says, Rav Kahana went, and he lay underneath the bed of Rav. I'm not going to tell you exactly what he heard, but at a certain point, his master realizes that he's down there. So he says, Kahana, you're here? Get out of here. This is not derech eretz, right? Look, it's not derech eretz, it's not proper. And he said to him, Torahi v'lelmod ani tzarich. So what I think this story is suggesting, or at least what the characters in the story are suggesting, right, is that there's a kind of a very broad conception of Torah that's reflected in this passage. It encompasses absolutely all of life, right, including how you go to the bathroom and how you sleep with your spouse. And it's a Torah that you learn from people, not only from texts, right? Torah hi v'lamod ani tzarich, right? So the content of Torah is very mundane and very broad, but also the method of learning Torah is that you're learning it from what people do in the course of the day-to-day living of your lives. And this breadth of understanding of Torah, that it relates to all aspects of life, is actually, I think, reflected in the very nature of Talmud. Right? Talmud is, if anything, an encyclopedic book. It relates to virtually everything. And this is true both in its halachic sections, but also in the agadic sections. Right? It not only has law and interpretation and argument and his stories, teachings, folk beliefs. You can learn on what nights you shouldn't walk in the streets because there's demons there. You can learn remedies for all sorts of things that ail you. You can learn how to keep the goat demons away when you go to the outhouse at night. Okay? I actually had a child who liked to recite that. But that was totally my fault. So I want to turn to the second story on the page here, which I think kind of expresses this well. Rav Huna says to Rabba, his son, he says, how come you don't hang out in the presence of Rav Chisda, whose teachings are sharp? And he says to him, what? Why should I go to him? When I go to him, he just talks about mundane things. So his father, he says to me, well, when you go to the bathroom, you shouldn't just sit down forcefully. And he explains why you shouldn't just sit down forcefully when you go to the bathroom. So why should I go to him? That's all he talks about, is silly things like that. So his father says to him, Hu asik b'chay debriyata b'at ame b'mili d'alma kol sheken zil gabe. Right? He's talking about things. Right? He's dealing with the things, with the lives of human beings, and you call them mere mundane things. Certainly, you should go to him. Right? So the father here, right, Rav Huna, is criticizing his son for not recognizing the importance of Rav Chisda's teaching. Right? This is not clever Torah. Right? There's no sharp teachings here. Right? These are the most mundane matters. Right? These are not, the kind of brilliant insights that the son is seeking to get from a teacher. And his father says to him, you've completely missed the point. Right? If you think that things that sustain life are mundane matters, then you don't understand Torah at all. Right? Then you need to become a disciple of this master, Rav Chisda, right? Not only to learn those specific teachings, but to learn, right, that the teachings that sustain life are exactly the Torah that you should be speaking. And so, one of the things that I think Talmud learning tells us is that the search for all kinds of knowledge is a religious act. Like curiosity, the desire to understand our religious dispositions. Now, for us, again, living in a very different world from the world of the Talmud, a lot of the explanations, a lot of the content of the Talmud can't necessarily satisfy our quest to understand. We may not believe in the demons or the spells or the folk remedies that Abaye learned from his foster mother. We might not connect to the dream interpretations collected in the final chapter of Brachot, although the ones that we have are probably not any better, but that's a separate issue that I'll get to in a minute. Right? So it's not necessarily that the content can satisfy our quest to understand, but the very fact that our teachers sought to understand the forces that threatened them and the illnesses that befell them and the dreams that they dreamt, and the fact that their understandings, that their quest for understanding are included in our sacred text, says something very powerful about what it means to learn Torah and about the religious nature of what it means to seek to understand. And I want to say two small things about this, that I think when we study Talmud, and when we, this aspect of Talmud, encountering a world that is so different from my own, offers at least two important challenges. Right? One is that it asks me to develop ways of looking at things that can make the strange familiar. And I'm encountering a strange world, and I'm being asked in some way to connect to that, in some way to find how, what kind of meaning that has. Right? It demands a kind of a leap of religious imagination, which is not a bad thing, religious imagination, actually. Religion requires a lot of imagination, right? And I don't know that we work hard enough to develop a religious imagination. So in a sense, this is asking us to develop that imagination. What does it mean when you're learning Masechet Zvachim and you find out that priests wading knee deep in blood in the temple courtyard, right, is a cool thing. Now you have to imagine a world, right, in which it's a praiseworthy thing for priests to walk around knee deep in. Did I say mud? Blood. Right, I meant blood, but right, I said blood. Good. Okay, in blood. Right. How is that embodying a different way of seeing the world? And am I missing a way of seeing the world if I don't try to access that? So on the one hand, this connects with certain things I was talking before, in place of humility, right, and kind of generosity toward trying to understand something so different from myself. But at the same time, I think it asks us to reflect on what might be missing from my own rather narrow way of seeing the world, and to imagine that. So Peter Berger, who's a sociologist of religion who I like to read every so often, I'm going to offer actually two quotes from him. The first one is in relation to this. He says, our ancestors didn't know about particle physics, but they spoke with angels. So we don't speak with angels. And I'm not saying we should be speaking with angels, right? But there's something about thinking what it might mean, right? What am I missing, right, when I don't know how to speak with angels, right? That the Talmud is asking us to imagine and to experience. And the flip side of that, right, the flip side of encountering a world so different from your own and trying to make that strange thing familiar, right, the flip side of that is that it also, in a way, helps you make the familiar strange. In other words, we so take for granted our own beliefs and assumptions. And what Berger likes to remind us is that there's a benefit to understanding the degree to which those are really pretty contingent things. And they change all the time. And when you're asked to when you're put face to face with the dissonance between a different world and your own, it doesn't mean that necessarily you leave behind everything that you believe and you just simply embrace the other. But it does ask you to look at your own things that you're so sure of and your own things that you so take for granted, and to imagine whether there's so there's something that you should be so sure about. So confronting a culture with different beliefs and practices, as we do when we enter the world of the Talmud, can help us take a step back, which does not mean we relinquish, but at least a step back from our own cultural beliefs and practices, and recognize the contingency of many of our own taken for granted aspects of our life, including perhaps some of our deeply held contemporary values. And here's where I want to offer another quote of Peter Berger. Peter Berger says the following thing about religious faith, but I'm going to quote it in relation to immersion in the thick culture of rabbinic texts. And what he says is, it is one powerful help in maintaining a reasonable distance from the ever-changing intellectual fashions of elite culture. I'm going to read that again. He says, religious faith, but I'm saying immersion in the thick culture of rabbinic texts, is one powerful help in maintaining a reasonable distance from the ever-changing intellectual fashions of elite culture. I think that's really useful.
Where did he say that?
He said that in, I think, I'll actually tell you where he said it. What's interesting about Peter Berger is that he's a sociologist of religion who is also a person deeply connected to his Christian faith. And so he tries to write about what it means to kind of stand outside and also be inside. It's a book, it's not his most famous book by any means, A Far Glory, The Quest for Faith in an Age of Credulity. It's a very good book, Age of Credulity. Okay, two more texts. I know there's three, but the last one is, we're going to do it, but it's separate. Okay, so two more texts, and we'll do these two quite quickly. This is another text I like a lot. This is just all an excuse to share some texts that I like a lot. Okay, this is actually from a Mishnah in Masechet Sotah. Bo bayom derash Rabbi Yeshua ben Hyrcanus lo avad Iyov et HaKadosh Baruch Hu ela me'ahava. Okay, so Rabbi Yeshua ben Hyrcanus on that day, darash, he taught, Iyov served God out of love. And I'm actually going to skip his proof. It's an interesting proof, but I'm going to skip that. I'm going to go to the fifth line in the Hebrew, which is the fifth to last line in the English. Amar Rabbi Yoshua, which is a different Rabbi Yoshua, right? Rabbi Yoshua is an older sage in this story. Amar Rabbi Yoshua, mi yagale afar me'einecha Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, right? Who will remove the dust from your eyes, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai? Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai is dead and buried. Right? He's the sage of the past. Rabbi Yeshua is the elder sage here, and Rabbi Yeshua ben Horkinos, who gave this teaching, is a younger sage. Okay, so Rabbi Yeshua says, right, because all of your days you taught that Eov served God only out of fear. As it says in chapter 1 of the book of Eov, Eov was a man of integrity and upright, fearing God and keeping from evil. Right? So it says he was a God-fearing person, so he served God out of fear. But look, Yehoshua, the student of your student, because it's Rabbi Yeshua talking. Rabbi Yeshua is the student of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, and now his student, this younger Rabbi Yeshua ben Horkinos, right? The student of your student has now taught that, in fact, Job did it. Eov acted out of love. So this is a kind of a cool text because it points, I think, to the power of what Rabbi David Hartman called Judaism's interpretive tradition. Right? The Talmud, it's not only that the Talmud is full of interpretation, but this Talmud, in a sense, is a celebration of interpretation and an invitation for ongoing interpretation. So what happens here, right, is that Rabbi Yoshua delights in the teaching of this younger sage, and not only delights in it, but is sure that his master, the now deceased Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, would have delighted in it. And he would have delighted in it despite the fact, or maybe because of the fact, that the teaching of this new young scholar actually shows that what he taught his whole life was completely wrong, right? He delights, he would, right? If only you would be alive now so you could see how your student's student shows, right, through interpretation, that the teaching that you taught your whole life was wrong, right? Wouldn't that be great, right? So that's pretty amazing, right? That the continuity here is a continuity of a seeking to understand, right? It's a continuity of interpretation, but not because, right, you buy the interpretation of the person who came before, right? But because you offer a new interpretation. What, this, of course, I mean, all of us who learn Talmud, who learn Torah Sheba'al Peh are very familiar with this. But the fact is that Torah Sheba'al Peh is, right, the very word Masechet is tractate is a Masechet. Masechet means a weaving, right? It's interconnected texts and traditions that invites us to continue weaving, right? You can always continue weaving that, right? You always can add your own interpretation and your own understanding here. So what I'm pointing to is the fact that the very continuity of Talmudic text, and we are continuers of that tradition, that the very continuity of that often takes the form of difference. Right? It's the very fact that each of us, each generation, each person brings something different to the text, right? Sees something in the text that perhaps nobody saw that before, that and even possibly, as in this case, completely turns on its head the teaching that was there before. That in and of itself is an expression of the continuity. It's the notion that Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai is, the true fulfillment of his teaching is not the content of the teaching, but the invitation for somebody to see it totally differently by engaging in that same quest for understanding and that same modality of interpretation. So my obligation to learn Torah is not complete, right, if I only learn the insights and interpretations of those who came before. And Torah Sheba'al Peh demands that I actively participate in the growth of Torah. And that's a big responsibility, because it means that Torah's growth depends on me. To the degree that I don't engage in that, I have not grown Torah, right? I've kept Torah from growing. And so I enact my commitment to Torah and to my teachers, present and past, by doing exactly what they have taught me to do, to interpret as they have interpreted, to seek to understand and to offer new understandings that themselves become part of Torah. And I want to refer here to something that I like to refer to a lot, because it was a very formative part of my educational experience. My education, the most formative part of my education was elementary school. Raise your hand if that was true for you too. Anybody else? That's it? Raise your hand high. That's it? Nobody else found elementary school to be the most formative?
We each went to the best yeshiva in the world.
Okay. In any event, my 5th grade teacher, Rabbi Gold, one day said, this was actually a Chumash class, he said, and this was a very from school, he said to us, anything that any of you says in this class is part of Torah Shabbat Peh. Part of Torah Shabbat Peh. And that's how I was brought up. That anything that we said in this class was part of Torah Shabbat Peh. And that's exactly what we have here. And it doesn't, and it's not about agreeing or disagreeing. In fact, it's the fact that he disagreed that grew Torah, because he added something new to Torah. The next thing, next text I want to do is, in a certain sense, the flip side or the opposite side of the coin of what I just said. And this is another kind of favorite text of mine. And this will be the last component, the last element that I want to talk about, and then I'll kind of close with the final text. This is a text from Masechet Shabbat. This is the passage where there's a lot of different midrashim about Matan Torah. And it says, I'll just read this one in English, a certain heretic saw Rava engrossed in study. And Rava had put his fingers under his leg, right? He's sitting on his hand, right? And he was crushing them, and his fingers were bleeding. So the heretic says to him, you rash people who put your mouth before your ears. What does it mean, put your mouth before your ears? They said, Nasa v'nishma, right? So they spoke before they listened. You should have first said, right? You first should have said, let's hear, and then we'll commit, right? So you put your mouth before your ears, you still persist in your rashness. First, you should listen. If you're able to accept it, accept it. And if not, do not accept it. Right? What are you struggling so hard, right? What are you struggling so hard with this? If it doesn't work for you, give it up. That's what he's saying. And what are you bleeding over this for? And Rava says to him, and this I'll read in the original, Anan desaginan b'shleimuta, k'tiv ban tumat yisharim tanchem. We who walk in wholeness, of us it is written, the integrity of the upright shall guide them. Okay? So we walk in wholeness, Rava says, right? Rava is struggling with the passage that he's learning, right? And we don't know if he's struggling because it's a particularly difficult text, or whether he's struggling because he finds it impossible to accept, right? We only know that his struggle is so intense, right, that he doesn't notice that his fingers are bleeding. Or maybe we should see his fingers bleeding as a kind of bodily expression of his pressure and his pain in trying to understand the Torah that he's learning, right? This is Talmud Torah that makes you bleed. And the heretic says, why are you bothering, right? Why not just accept the parts of Torah you accept and reject the parts of Torah that you can't accept? And Rava says that's not possible because we walk in wholeness. Ananda saginim b'shleimotu. We walk in wholeness. And Rashi says on that, we walk with him, with God, right? We walk with him in wholeness of heart, as one does out of love. So I want to talk for a minute about this idea of walking in wholeness of heart as one does out of love. There's lots of ways you can study Torah and lots of ways you can study Talmud. And one particularly nice way to study Talmud is by picking and choosing the parts you like. And this happens a lot, right? There are a lot of settings in which you can be treated to the greatest hits and to the most meaningful parts. And there are settings in which that's a very appropriate thing to do, by the way. I'm not saying that's never a good thing to do, but overall, if you're really a person learning Torah, what this text is saying, Saginan b'shleimuta, we walk in wholeness of heart as one does out of love, and wholeness of heart means also that we walk with the whole. And so what I want to talk a little about here is the fact that at the end of the day, when we study Talmud, there are parts of it that are just plain hard. And again, hard in all the different possible meanings of that term. Sometimes they're just plain hard. It's difficult. It's a very difficult discipline, right? No matter how studied we are in Talmud, we will find sugyot that are hard. Also hard sometimes because there are passages that just reflect worlds that we don't connect to. As I said before, worlds have demons that roam on certain nights of the week. There's also a lot of material to which we might find difficult to relate. Laws about sacrifice, rules about purity. We may relate to that, we may not relate to that. And of course, there's also passages that are hard because they reflect values and viewpoints that we might feel are antithetical to our own beliefs and values and viewpoints. So Talmud is hard in all of those different ways. So the heretic says, why bother? And I've tried to suggest in earlier parts of this talk different, not reasons we should bother, I'm trying to get away from the why, but different significances to what it means to bother studying Talmud. But here I want to focus in this last part on the very notion of bothering, right? The very notion of doing something that's hard, and the very notion of being willing to encounter a text which you know, with some frequency, is going to put things before you that are hard in all these different ways of hard. And what I wanted to say here, and I sort of wrote about this in a little Daf Yomi symposium a couple years ago when there was the Daf Yomi, is that in a certain sense, Talmud study, and especially regular Talmud study, and especially if it's regular Talmud study al haseder, where you're taking a masechet and learning it straight through, or where you're going straight through the daf over the course of 7.5 years, that regular Talmud study is an expression of, or perhaps we could say an enactment of, a relationship. And in that sense, it's kind of like a marriage, right? It's a covenantal relationship. It's a commitment that you take, and that commitment is born of love, and it is sustained by love. And as in any committed relationship, like a marriage or like Daf Yomi, right? In that relationship, you have to open yourself up to what is there. You don't get to pick and choose what face the other shows you each day, whether the other is going to encounter you with a grumpy face or a smiling face, right? Whether you like each moment with the other. Right? You have to encounter the totality of the other as it presents itself each day. You don't pick and choose. And so sometimes you encounter things that trouble or upset you. Sometimes you encounter things that you can't affirm, but being in relationship with the whole and expressing that relationship in your openness to encounter the whole. And I think that's what Rashi means when he says we walk with it in wholeness of heart as one does out of love. And so what I want to suggest here is that the very experience of struggle, like the fact that Talmud study is something that is hard in all of these different ways of being hard, is actually an integral part of the construction and maintenance of the relationship with Torah. It's not much of a relationship if it's only always pleasant all the time, right? What strengthens the relationship, what enacts a commitment to a relationship, is actually being there, whatever the daf is going to be showing you. Which doesn't mean, right, that there aren't moments of joy, of discovery, of spiritual meaning, of revelation, right? But it also means that a full relationship means relating to the whole and being open to the whole. And it's the openness to whatever I might find and the effort that I put into trying to understand. It's in those things that I enact and experience the depth of my commitment to Torah and my love of Torah. So in a way, this aspect of study that I'm talking about is almost the opposite, right, or almost kind of the flip side of the previous one that I talked about, the Yochanan ben Zakkai one. That one was talking about a study characterized by chidush, right, by the joy of adding your own voice to the interpretive tradition, by challenging what came before, by joining in the conversation of Torah. And this one is more about opening yourself up to Torah. So we both join our voice to the ongoing conversation of Torah, and we also open ourselves to the voice that Torah presents to us. we are Doresh Torah, and we're also Mikabel Torah. So it's in both the listening, which is what the Rava story talks about, and the speaking, which is what the Yochanan ben Zakkai story talks to us about, both in the listening and the speaking, that my relationship to Torah and to the learners of Torah is realized and sustained. I'm actually going to skip the last source. It's just a little source that talks about how the face that you choose to bring to the other, whether that other is a person or whether that other is Torah, reflects back to you. That the way you approach another person, and we all know this, if you smile at another person, they're more likely to smile back at you. If you're grumpy, they're more likely to be grumpy at you. And the suggestion in this text is that that's the same with Torah as well. And that's all I want to say, and I'm not going to actually elaborate in the interest of time, but that's all I want to say is that the different aspects of Talmud Torah that I have been talking about here are obviously a choice. Right? There's many different ways in which one can choose to approach Torah and to approach Talmud study. What I've tried to put out here is certain elements that I think are important, certain elements that I think can, as I said at the beginning, help to kind of cultivate dispositions of the mind and heart that are important or that challenge us in growing in growing our religious lives. And of course, one could make very, very different choices and lead to very, very different results. So I'll stop with that. I know it's late. If people leave if people have questions, open to questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you.